Keep the learning on.
Look at us. Ain't we cool?
Greg's like the guy in the audience when everybody's clapping in time. He's like,
right. No worries. Well, if you've been following this, it's the beginning. Why? No, if you've been following all our episodes, you know that we've been talking a lot about going on a journey, an adventure. And today, our pal Simone is actually on an adventure. And so, Simone, talk to us a little bit so we can see where you are and what you're doing.
Hey, got the sunnies gone. It's what can I say? It's summer. It's southwest of France, and
we are frozen on video.
oh, well.
And we have good cell coverage in the south of France.
There you go. But we must have pretty good cell coverage because it's been pretty consistent. But Simone will be showing us a little bit of her. Oh, there she is.
There she is.
She's back.
Hey,
we lost you.
got me?
Yeah, we lost you.
We lost you.
Shall I show you the roads?
Yes, please.
Please do.
Okay. So
there
we got the roads. Well, actually, you know, why did I switch it just when you can't see the hillsides and everything? That's like a bit lame, isn't it? You don't have to lock down. This is what you get to see.
Great.
Oh my God.
So
great.
if you were traveling in France, this is what you'd see.
See, yeah, that's just through this little bit. But we need a more prettier thing to show you later on, I think.
And so we're going to be sharing in your story as you go. And that's what today's episode is all about. Share your story. It's nice to have a story, and it doesn't matter how complicated or complex or simple it is. But as Dylan Thomas said, for the story, which he called a story, and he said, if you can call it a story, it has no real beginning and no end, and there's very little in the middle. So that's kind of like what we've been talking about, I think.
It's like, hey, that's my story, Roy.
Sometimes you make it up as you go along. And so you can, but you should be able to tell your story. That's the point that we want to get at today. And we're going to talk a little bit about why you might want to do that. And maybe we'll tell a story or two. Who knows? I could tell a story. We could talk about commitment to work. Now that's a great subject. You know, how committed, how engaged are you with work? Or I could tell you about Madman Mahoney. Now I've got your interest already, right? You want to know Madman Mahoney? Well, in the summer of 1940, I was working underneath the East River in New York City. See, now I've got twice your interest. As a sand hog, which is the digger of tunnels. It's the International Brotherhood of Caisson Bridge and Tunnel Workers, in case you want the full title. And working on a couple of tunnels there under the East River. And one of them, they made a mistake, which occasionally happens in engineering. And they poured some concrete for a subway platform, which was halfway up the tunnel, so about 35 feet off the bottom of the tunnel. And about 35 feet from the top of the tunnel, they poured the subway platform. And guess what? They poured it in the wrong place.
Oops.
So now what they needed to happen was for somebody to go take a chipping hammer, you know, a good old jackhammer, and go out and stand on that concrete and chip it out from underneath himself, 35 feet off the bottom of the tunnel. And the big question was, who can we get to do that? Well, the answer, of course, was Madman Mahoney. Let's get Mahoney to do it. So Madman was a guy who would show up in the hog house, which was basically the locker room, the sand hogs, every morning at 6:15 or whatever, with a paper bag, and would put his paper bag down and open up his locker and take out his hard hat and his rain gear and his boots and reach inside the paper bag and pull out a can of Budweiser. Down went the Budweiser, put on his gear, and off to work we go. How pleasant. So they call on Madman, and Madman gets out there with his chipping hammer and starts working on chipping the cement out from underneath himself. And everybody knows that sooner or later there's not going to be enough holding it up, and it's going to collapse. And Madman knows this too, but what the heck? And so, of course, it did. And down goes the chipping hammer and Madman Mahoney and everything else into a pile of rubble at the bottom of the tunnel. And of course, everybody stops and looking at the pile of rubble. First thing that come out of the pile of rubble, the chipping hammer. Madman's lifting it up, and he pops out of the pile of rubble, and he yells, "Am I going to get paid for this?" Now that, my friends, is commitment to work. See, now I could have told you about engagement in your work, but I much rather would have told you about Madman Mahoney, and that will stick with you now. You'll think about the guy who broke the concrete out from underneath himself and fell 35 feet and then asked if he was going to get paid for it. So there you go.
It sounds a little bit like how modern organizations handle change management, honestly.
Yes.
I was thinking more about the HR and OH&S component.
Well, I mean, there's that. Hey, I'd like to call out to my friend Jeff, who joined us this morning. Hey, Jeff, how are you?
Good morning. How are you doing,
Hey,
Greg?
Jeff.
Everyone?
Good.
Thanks for joining us.
This is
thanks for inviting me.
This is episode 14 of the Keeping the Learning On, which we encourage everybody to go back and listen to earlier episodes, because we're moving along a journey, and today we're talking about, as you saw, Madman Mahomes and sharing of your story. I wonder, you guys, have you ever seen, like, Roy just kind of set the bar really, really high. Roy is a spectacular storyteller. If you know Roy for more than 10 minutes, you know that he's a great storyteller. Some people aren't. And there's some people, and I'm not going to name names, there's some people that start to tell a story and it's like, all right, I'm going to go get another cup of coffee, right? Because they don't know how to tell a story. They're not good at telling a story. And I think that in a lot of ways, we are our story. I mean, we tell others how to perceive us. We tell the world where we fit in by the stories that we tell, or how we tell our story. And so if we don't tell our story, if we're not good at telling our story, or if our story sends a message other than maybe what we would like to send, I think it can do a great deal of harm or non-good to us. Yeah, this is a really good quote. Telling stories is one of the most powerful means that leaders have to influence, teach, and inspire. And I really agree with that. That's actually from a Harvard Business Review article that I also read. And so let's talk about, how do you tell your story? What are the basics of telling a story?
Sometimes it's nice to start with how not to tell a story.
Okay.
I've got one for you.
Well,
I was just thinking maybe I should start telling a story and see how I do,
when
right?
we're talking about leaders who are inspiring, there is a story that I can share. I can't share who it is, but there was a merger and acquisition, and there was something lost in the translation, but the chairman of the board came and decided he would address this new acquisition and all the people in it. And so they had a town hall, and the story he told was about how you are all lemons on my lemon tree, and I am going to squeeze. He had a few people walk out the door and a number of people quit. And so something was lost in the translation because he was from a different country. And so when he tried to tell the story, he told it in such a way that made them sound like they have no value. So that's how not to tell a story. And as leaders, we have the opportunity to be compelling, create connection, build trust, set perspective. And I think it's really important to know what you're trying to convey first and reverse engineer from that.
Well, it's interesting because I think a story has multiple layers, right? I mean, if you look at, let's say, we're all familiar with storytelling of movies. Modern movies tell a story, but on most on a well-done movie, there's the story, and then there's a meaning, and then there's the underlying concepts, which usually become philosophical or human nature kinds of challenges, or what is it that folks are dealing with. And so you see a story played out on multiple levels, and then you can move meaning from layer to layer, and try to help understand where you fit at. Do I agree with this? Is this true? Is this true for me? Is this instructive for me in something that I've been through, or something that I'm going to go through in the future?
Well, Greg, there's something I wouldn't mind adding to that. I mean, by the way, which screen have you got, the road or me?
You.
We're seeing you.
Oh, that's perfectly fine, because you don't want to see this traffic jam right now.
With the sunnies, as you Aussies call them.
Yeah. So, but you were talking about, all those great things that like a movie will help us tell a story. Something that's really critically important, though, because it's about setting the context and the mood as well. You've got the underlying music that plays with it. You've got the visual aspects of what you see in a room, or the little sounds that come along with a slamming door and things like that. Don't forget, there are the smaller things that we would do with our teams, how we've set the room, how we've set the environment. Those matter as well when we're telling the story.
So you bring up something really interesting, and I don't want to go into great length, but my daughter went to film school, and her focus within film production was what they call production design, or PD, as they like to call it. And production design is everything you see on screen that an actor doesn't touch, because those are props. So production design are, if you ever, and I'm fascinated by this, but if you look at a movie or watch a movie, in the scene, there'll be garbage in the garbage can that helps move the story. There'll be a poster on the board with, little phone numbers torn off, with just the right number of them torn off. And production design, so in a movie, there is what they call the creative team, the writer, the director, the cinematographer, and they're responsible for what is the story and how are we telling it. And production design is considered part of the creative team. And the reason is you can't set a scene without understanding, what do we want people to feel? How do we want people to think? Where do we want to draw not just their attention on the screen, but their attention in the unfolding of the story? And everything you see and everything you hear helps to tell the story. And I think we're so familiar with that in popular media, movies, books, other media we consume. But in our own storytelling, we haven't perfected that. We haven't really gotten that good at it in a great many cases, right?
It
Right.
certainly is the subtleties that go with it. I mean, that's definitely being able to pull together that storyline, like the recent project I've been on, to also include things like, for example, archive footage. And that's a really interesting thing, like pulling a story from the past that still has relevancy in what it's saying today. Or to what it is that you're trying to convey at that particular time. And never starting the sentence with, "Oh, when I was a boy," like my dad did.
No, please don't tell that story.
Please don't tell that story again. Yes, the again. But, I think that's definitely part of it, being able to draw on other experiences and ideas that they will have seen as well, to add flavor to what it is that you're trying to communicate.
Yeah.
Many times, go ahead.
Sorry, when we're working with clients, there is so much you can do through storytelling to actually help shape a culture. Right. So you not just your own story, but the story of the organization is really, really important as well. And there is something about the importance of helping people be more open to change, more open to learning, and opening the door that storytelling can achieve. And you can't achieve it just by saying, here's our vision, follow it. There is this important amount of connecting the compelling reasons for why the business is doing what it is.
It's also true in organizations that the stories of the culture are instructive to what's valued. So there'll in every organization that's been around for a few years, there's stories of the founders or the key folks. I worked for Hewlett Packard, and there's the infamous story of Bill Hewlett coming in on the weekend, and there's a padlock on the lab stock room where you go get electronics components and tools. And he goes after it with a pry bar and rips the thing off and puts a hand signed note. He said, never lock the tools to innovation. Nobody in the corporation knows whether that actually happened, but it communicates the vision of the founding fathers that we are about innovation, and we will stop at nothing to be innovative. We will not let bureaucracy or those other things that beset existing organizations to keep us from innovation and unlocking the tools that allow us to be successful. And
But
that's
do you
a
know
story.
what else it is? And you know what else that story tells? If you look at the other lessons, it also tells, gives trust.
Yes.
I've taken the lock off the door. I'm trusting in my people to do what they need to do.
Trust and perspective, right? So really setting a perspective view of who we are as an organization.
Jeff, you were nodding there. You're agreeing with that statement that it's trust building to have the stories told. So do you have thoughts on the subject?
Yeah, one thing that I could add to the conversation, and Greg knows this, I've told him a little bit about my story, is I've been a part of Toastmasters for the past 10 years. And so a little bit of a shameless plug there. We get into giving all different types of speeches. Yeah, awesome, Roy. It's really been a great experience for me. And one of the things that I've learned in terms of telling stories is the guidance that we've learned is really to try and break the story, especially from a creative standpoint, into three parts. You have three acts, so to speak. The first act is you've got to introduce the main character and the circumstances and give you a reason to care about that person or to care about what's going on with them. And then Act 2 is really where you come in and they have some type of very difficult circumstance or some insurmountable looking challenge that they've got to go through, or some type of a surprising element that happens to them that's very unexpected. It's like, oh my gosh, now what are they going to do? And is there any way that they're going to make it through that situation? And then Act 3, of course, is then the resolution. They come together, they overcome the challenge, they beat the odds, they make it through and have some type of resolution. Not to say that that's always a happy thing, right? There could be some things that go along the way that are difficult, but ultimately the point in a lot of the cases is to say, this person's just an ordinary person. They had some very difficult circumstances or some insurmountable odds. They made it through. I can do that too, right? I can be that person. It's not just that there's this special person who's born this way or has these innate abilities. And that's one of the things I really like about good stories, is it's something that you can relate to, you can plug yourself into that situation. And I think to put it into more of a corporate setting, how do leaders get to the point where they're at? And then it's the ability that just because you've made it to a certain place, it doesn't mean that you don't stop learning, you don't stop growing, you don't stop having challenges that you have to get through. And then if you can realize that it's not just about you, but you've got to have the larger team, the larger community, bringing everybody together to achieve that larger purpose, then I think that storytelling can be really powerful in a corporate setting as well.
You might say part of keeping the learning on.
Might.
Thanks, Jeff.
Jeff,
you, Jeff.
did you like binge watch the previous episodes? Because so much of what you touched on are things that we've talked about. Gathering people in and it was interesting when you were describing the parts of a story, and I'm thinking, okay, we introduced the character of Madman Mahoney at the beginning. We told you a little bit about him. We got you interested in it. Then we had his conundrum, which was, chip this concrete out from underneath himself. The crisis is when the concrete collapses, and the resolution is when he holds up the chipping hammer. Now, did I think through that when I tell the story of Madman Mahoney? No, it's the story of Madman Mahoney, period. But yeah, great. And you can learn to do that. I learned how to tell stories from my dad. My dad, a lot of parents read books to their children. My dad did not do that, did it very rarely. My dad told stories. He would just come in and sit on the edge of the bed and would tell me a bedtime story. He had characters that he developed, he had, there was a horse named Dobbin and grandma and grandpa, and had nothing to do with where we lived or how we lived or anything else. They just sprang from him. And that's where I learned how to tell stories, was from him. And just before I close the gap, I'll just say that there's also the bigger truth that this is how we all, as a civilization, as a multitude of civilizations, learned culture literally through the telling of stories. We didn't have the ability to write things down. Of course, ancient civilizations didn't have the written word, but the spoken word is so powerful. And especially when there are refrains in that. I mean, if you go back and study oral tradition at all, as I have, you know that there are refrains, and literally songs are part of the stories as well. And so we learn to tell these stories, and around those stories develops your culture. It's very literally true.
And we share in other ways. So there's a wonderful place in Alberta, where I live, Alberta, Canada, called Writing on Stone, and it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's got the greatest concentration of rock art in North America. So there's 50 petroglyph sites with thousands of works in them. And we've been telling stories for over 9,000 years, both in, but it's imagery, it's setting a tone, it's telling your history and bringing it forward. It's giving us the opportunity to realize that whoever passes this way has an opportunity to learn about us. So that's about 9,000 years old. It's they're indigenous drawings that were done primarily by the Blackfoot, but also the Shoshone. And it's really kind of neat, because when I was in Egypt, I also saw some amazing tablets made out of limestone that were carved in some of the early way of sharing our language and passing on our stories. And I think our stories tell us where we came from, but they also help us understand where we're going. And I think that the balance between where we came from and where we're going is a really important piece organizationally of shaping that culture as well.
And I think in the context of a corporation, I think the stories do exactly that. Help us to understand the history of the organization, especially for younger members. And I don't necessarily mean by age, but those that have joined the organization. Help me understand what this organization is about. How did we get where we are? But also help me to see myself in this organization going forward. What can I contribute? How can I resonate with who we are, how we do things to help us achieve what our goals and objectives are. I think that's really important. Here's something that I had talked about earlier, is like, whatever your story is, whatever story you're telling, it's got to be authentic. My grandfather was a great storyteller, but somewhere around the time I was 14 years old, listening to stories, I realized that, wait, I've heard this story before. Probably this is time 3 or 4. And the tale got taller every time he told the story. And it dawned on me that, to whatever degree the story was based in truth, it was well beyond that at this point in time. And it was intentional, because he had a great sense of humor. But when we're in an organization and we're trying to achieve change or try to achieve business goals, if it's not authentic, if there's not a good reason why we're going to release this product or this service, people aren't going to resonate with it. And people are incredibly adept at determining inauthentic messages. How many of us have sat through quarterly, metrics reporting that says, things are down a little bit, but in the next quarter, we're going to be releasing new products and new profitability, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, same thing. It's like, I don't know whether it's 1982 or 92 or 2002. I'm really confused, because there's nothing new. There's nothing unique. There's nothing authentic about this. So help me to understand why we're releasing this product. What's the reason? Why do I get on board with this? Why do I work nights and weekends to help get this product out on time, on budget, and high quality? Why do I do that? And I think when we choose to tell stories that are elements from Wall Street Journal and from, wherever your sources of wisdom or smart elements, if in doubt, quote Steve Jobs, right? Then you sound really, really smart and whatnot. but it's inauthentic. And so tell your story. Tell who you are. Tell what you believe. Tell what you feel. Tell what your hopes and aspirations are. And there's a vulnerability and an authenticity to that I believe is compelling.
I think if we sit on the surface of storytelling, if we just rest on top of it, we set off red flags and trust meters. And trust is one of the key components to performance, right? If I trust where I'm going, if I believe in what I'm doing, if I see purpose in how I contribute to that, my performance increases. And there's science that says this is a complete link, and the storytelling has the opportunity, like you said, if it's authentic, and the trust meter isn't going off, and red flags aren't being set.
Simone is back.
Hi, Simone.
We lost you for a minute.
And maybe she, if she's connected up, maybe she can
Hi
come off
there.
mute. There you are. Can you show us your road?
Yeah, should I? No, traffic jam. You don't want to see this. It's boring.
Okay.
See, this
Okay.
is. Oh, well,
Hey, wait a
let's
minute
try,
now. Put it in context.
Yeah,
It's a traffic jam in the south of France.
Yeah, I was going to say a French
It's
traffic jam.
different.
Yeah, look at that.
There you
Look at
go.
that.
Look at
It's like,
There's a guy opening a bottle of wine on the side of the road there.
We could play a game with you. We could play Renault Peugeot.
Yeah.
Renault Peugeot.
where am I?
Yeah.
Is the question.
Wimwell? Oh dear.
Look at that.
There you go.
Advertising.
Yes. Look at that. There's a French billboard. Wow.
Wow.
We'll go back to, we were talking about Steve Martin earlier before we came on. And Steve Martin said, wow, those French people have a different word for everything.
Everything.
They do indeed.
Yes.
So speaking of Steve Martin, reach outside your discipline
Yes.
is great. That goes with Steve Martin when even early in his stand-up days when he used to pick up the banjo, and suddenly after a few notes, you realize that Steve Martin is a top of the world-class banjo player. Not many people knew that then. People know now, of course, but back then, who expected it? They thought he was just going to goof around on the banjo, and he rips off a couple of banjo classics at a million miles an hour and every note perfect, and made people realize that, hey, this guy knows what he's doing. And that's one way to reach outside of discipline. Another way to do it is to take elements of something that you've learned. You can talk about launching a project by describing how a plane takes off, right? That's just a simple example that sprang to mind. Get outside the discipline. You don't have to put it all in a box and not reference things that are outside. It's good to bring in things from outside. That's how you innovate. You take two disparate ideas or different things, put them together, and presto changeo, you wind up with something unexpected a lot of the time. And it's being able to tell your story is learning when to bring elements in and how they fit together, and making sure that they do resonate with other people. There's a magic that happens when somebody tells you a story that makes sense to you, and it gets to you on a deeper level than just reciting facts. Now, many of you know that I do a lot of presentations that are wrapped around research and statistics, and what percentage of did that and and that's one thing. But the other thing is to make those metrics resonate. I do a presentation called Your Metrics Are Talking, but Are You Listening? And I try to talk about letting your metrics tell a story, right?
So I'm glad that you went there, Roy, because I was going to jump on your thing there a little bit. It's like, yes, you do make presentations that are very derived from data, but what I've seen you do, Roy, and I've seen this, maybe a dozen times, is you help me to see what the story in my data is, or help me to see it multidimensionally. Like, what is this telling you? It's the whole, data, information, knowledge, wisdom. And it's like, if we operate down in the metrics level, it's like, yeah, okay, so that's true. But what does it mean? And what do we do about what it means? I like the storytelling element, and and it's completely stolen on my part, but tell the story in 3 acts of what, so what, now what. So help me to understand what is the thing that you're talking about, and tell me why it's important, and then help me to understand what it is that I should do about whatever that thing is. And I think it's almost so I've been working on this whole idea is like, if you just happen to get on an elevator, which is a odd likelihood in the last 2 months, since this has been my existence for the last 2 months. But if you happen to hop onto an elevator with somebody that you really respect in the industry or in the world, and they said, "Hey, what are you about?" And up to this point, the way I answer that question usually starts with some kind of a laugh that says, "Wow, it's really complicated. It's very difficult to explain to you what I'm about." And most people accept that. Okay, that's good. Well, good to meet you. Off we go, right? So I missed an opportunity to tell what I'm really about, which is I'm very passionate about what I do. There's a lot of depth and a lot of history and a lot of people that I've helped over the years that would say, no, it's not that complicated. In fact, you make things that are very complicated relatively easy for me to understand. So that's your story. I was like, oh, interesting. So the ability to tell a story succinctly and to connect it with people. In a story, you can tell a story in 3 or 4 seconds, a very powerful, compelling story if you're connecting with the right things.
I think in teaching and learning, when we do either facilitation or helping to bring a concept across, really what both of you have said is about relevance, right? How do you make it relevant to your audience?
Mm-hmm.
How do you make their experience be able to connect emotionally with the story so that that data has meaning? It's about bringing a meaningful relevance to what you're sharing.
So, Patty, I'm going to put you on the spot. You're no stranger to the boardroom when you're leading organizational change or helping organizations to change. Is how do you get them to see their story in a different light, or see themselves as part of a different story than the one that they're entrenched in? How do you open their eyes?
One of the most important things is for them to hear their own stories, right?
Oh, interesting.
So to be able to have the opportunity to tell how we got there. So when we do a current state, we really wrap around that current state, how exactly we got here and why it's a challenge. And we do that in multiple levels, because often the boardroom itself does not have an opportunity to hear those stories. So when we're putting a transformation team together, we say, hey, we need people from different areas of the organization, not just your top 80 leaders or whatever it is. We will say we need to bring in some stories, and I help them craft that with their communications person, and we pull it together and put a presentation together about current state. And when the board is saying we want to go here, we help those people tell their stories on how they think that can make a difference from where they stand.
And so a lot of it is connecting the dots, Patty, is what you're saying, right?
Yes.
It's connecting the dots, which brings us to something that Simone said this is how this works, folks. I'll just give you a quick backstory. We meet earlier in the week for a little while, and we talk about what's next on our series of steps on our journey. And we talk about some things that interest us or intrigue us about that particular topic. So this is one of the things that Simone had to say during that conversation. And we see that you're back moving out of the traffic jam now, Simone. You want to chime in here about connecting the dots and pulling things together?
Oh, yeah. Although it's a bit hard to read what's on the slide there, Roy. Do you want to read it out for me?
Sure. How you connect the dots, how you pull things together. Just because someone else has said it, don't shut your voice down. You need to know how you've understood it. And then you also said what is uniquely me cannot be done by someone else, which I think is one of the key points that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, it is. I think, we do see things in a very different way, as Patty was talking about, what was the story of how whether it's the organization got there or you as the individual. We've all known when we've changed jobs as well, or we've got a new manager coming in. It's like, new kingdom building coming up, They're going to shift and change everything to the way they want it. And this is the interesting thing, is that, well, how did we connect to even getting into that organization? What was it that led us there in the first place? What was it that we saw that made us want to be a part of that organization's story? Or even when we join a team, it's the same thing, or we take on a particular role, not even just for the organization. Maybe it's the role itself that was really interesting and exciting, or a next step as part of our journey to get where we want to go. So it's an interesting thing when we think about how do we connect the dots in that story, or when we're listening to someone else's. By the way, just checking, are you looking at the road or at me right now?
We're looking at the road.
So there's a thing we do when we're doing a design thinking exercise, when you're trying to create something new or solution something. And in the design thinking piece, there is this really important section where we talk about tell your story. So we start with challenges based on where we're trying to go, but we ask people not to have a preconceived idea of how to get there. And then we ask, you know, based on these challenges, we break up into groups and ask everyone to tell a story when that was a particular challenge, whether it's at this organization or another organization. And that keeps people from getting into groupthink. We actually, we hear other people's stories, we begin to resonate with the relevance to them. It builds empathy and understanding that we might not have had before. And that diverse thinking leads to a better how might we. And that storytelling and design thinking is probably one of the most important pieces that we do.
And of course, one of the things,
I think from my perspective, when I hear other people's stories, and you know, we not only have the empathy for it, but you know, we may have gone through the same type of thing, but in a different way. And that's very much what I was talking about in connecting the dots, that because somebody has said the same thing or has the same type of story doesn't mean that we shouldn't participate in that conversation, that we shouldn't participate in adding the nuances, those things that were a unique perspective that we can bring to that same conversation.
That actually triggers an interesting thought, in that is, I think good storytellers inspire participation. It's so easy when you're listening to really good speakers or people who are good storytellers to respond by saying, well, you know, that's it, we're done here, or I can't add anything, or my stories will never be that compelling, or whatever. And I think good storytellers, good leaders, good people who are engaged with other human beings recognize that people are shutting down and tuning out. And Patty, I think that, you know, I'm fascinated by the exercise. Maybe you and I can have a chat offline about that, but the exercise of encouraging leadership to tell their stories or to view it in terms of a story, because I think there's something disarming in that. You know, we all can pull facts and figures into a presentation and say, this is our strategy, but a story is innately personal. It's me, it's my experience and background and my passions. I think it gets closer to authenticity, or it demands more authenticity of us if we tell a story.
It also creates a connection with me. You know, we land in this building, there's 400 of us. We all go up the elevator, we march to our little desk, we do our own thing. When we hear another person's story, they become a companion in our work journey. We begin to relate to them. The emotion it draws from us gives us the opportunity to say, hey, you know what? I've been through that too. And all of a sudden some camaraderie begins to occur. And it does, it changes the dynamic.
Or what happens is somebody says suddenly, I never knew that about you.
Yeah.
I didn't know that was, you know, which is eye-opening and enlightening and creates a human connection at the same time.
I was in a conversation last night with someone who was on a call, and it was a global call. There were people from all over the world. Every continent was participating, and they were all going through telling something about themselves that no one else would know. And my friend was very nervous about that. She doesn't like to talk about herself. And the only thing she could come up with was the biggest thing in her life. And it completely changed the entire conversation, because she said, well, what you don't know about me is that I died. And I was in a terrible accident and I died for a while and I came back. And it has shaped the reason why I'm here. And that turned into a purposeful conversation that allowed the opportunity to talk about why they were actually on this mission together. And it was a really neat to hear her tell how nervous she was to say it, but how it unified the team.
Oh, that was, and that was deeply personal and authentic. Yeah. And here I am touched by proxy from that story. So thank her for that. But I think there's a lesson to be learned in that. A little bit of vulnerability, a little bit of authenticity, I think goes a long ways. Obviously, there's some environments where telling personal stories or telling an authentic story may just expose your vulnerability to political or adversarial opponents in negative ways. That's a risk you run to be an authentic leader.
It is a risk you run, but also there is an art to how you frame it.
Yes.
Because you can open the door to attack, or you can set yourself up as the hero in the story in a way of speaking, right?
Yeah, there's an art of storytelling, and I feel like we haven't fully covered it because we haven't gotten to the practical aspects of it. So how do you tell your story? Hey, Patty, I'm not doing this to you, but what is your 90-second elevator speech? Who are you? What's your story? How did you get in life to this moment that you're right here now on this call with us, making this broadcast? I mean, there's a lot of applications. So I guess in a way, my call to action to any listeners live or on the recordings is write your story down. Try to understand what your story is and try to understand it in as succinct terms as possible. So telling me, the list of dates that you went to work for or got promoted or other things, it's like, well, that's a good way to start. That might tell you the road that you went down. But as Simone is proving, the journey ahead has traffic jams and scenery and roadside signs and all kinds of stuff. And the flavor of the story is what happened on the way here. Right. So I worked in corporate life. Okay. Nobody really cares all that much. What did you learn while you were there? And how has that made you?
How has that shaped you as a human?
Exactly. Yeah. And why might I care about that, Greg? And it's like, it's a different way of telling stories. I mean, some people love to tell stories where it's like, and then there was the time that I saved the company $6 million. That was the time that I realized that I was awesome, and everybody thinks that I'm awesome, including you, Patty. Think that I'm awesome because this story is all about me. And what's the message, right?
No, I think you're sometimes awesome, Greg.
Yeah. Thank you. Somebody needs to think so. But
I pay Greg to be awesome twice a week, whether he needs to be or not. It's as simple as that.
So I think that a really important piece of the message I'd like to leave is that there is this idea we all walk around in the universe with, and that we're not very extraordinary, that we lead these mundane lives because we all do the same thing. We have to cook our meals, we have to, and that there is some idea that if I tell my story, I need to be extraordinary. And I think the importance is not to diminish your story because it is the small, unique experiences that shape you that actually make you extraordinary.
I fully agree with that.
Speaking of extraordinary,
Simone, you're back.
We're back on the road with Simone.
Well, I was actually just thinking, Greg, I did hear just before it clicked out to reconnect again, is that, there's the traffic jams and the road signs and everything else in between the pretty scenery, if I can ever find some. Although I think there's some coming. But we tend to hide that stuff away, don't we? I mean, yes, we tend to not want people to see the traffic jams, etc. And as this trip is proving, the signal drops out every now and again. Sometimes you have to, go offline for a little bit and take a breath, and then come back online again. And that has to be part of it, because sometimes when we want to talk about the stories is how we need to think about how we want to communicate that. We want to say, well, what's the depth of the meaning behind it? And not to say, as you were saying before, Patty, that it doesn't matter, the little things do matter. As we were talking about earlier with the script, it's all part of the scenery. It's all part of the way it makes people feel when they either read your story or hear your story. And there's a number of different ways we can communicate it, because that might be, I know there are times when I've come into an organization, and the first thing that I've usually done is ask them to give me what were the three great things that are going on for them right now, and what are the three crappy things going on for them right now. And it's a really practical thing to do. And then it's really interesting, not just for the individual and for the individual to know that you've heard their story, but when you come back into the group meeting, it's amazing how you can weave together the things that people that have said that are very similar, very much the same, and the things that are uniquely different. And then to bring that back into the group and say, guess what? We've got an amazing book being written right now. And actually they will recognize themselves as you're telling the story.
Absolutely.
And I think that's really a cool thing to do.
And so we're getting close to time here. And Jeff, how kind of you to come, first of all, in spite of the fact that you know Greg. And what have you been thinking as you've been listening to us chat back and forth? And since you're new to the group, other than Greg, we like to know a little bit about your story. What are you thinking?
Yeah, a lot of really good reminders. I really like, Patty, what you're talking about with how you're incorporating the storytelling into the boardroom and the leadership side. And one of the things that I do, probably have a similar background to Greg in a lot of ways. I'm a IT consultant and trainer. I teach ITIL and Agile and DevOps classes. And some of the process team stuff that we do is we're trying to get everybody on the same page, right? We're trying to do the elevator pitch and have everybody be able to share the same message of answering the why question and the what, so what, now what type of stuff, very similar things. And I think thinking about that from a storytelling standpoint is really interesting, because it's one thing to go into an organization and say, here's our vision and our mission and our purpose, or here are our core values or our guiding principles. But then on top of that, then that's great. People can memorize that and be expected to repeat that. I was in my first organization where literally senior leadership would walk around and quiz people and make sure that they had those things memorized. It's like, okay, that's great. But then from a team building standpoint and really getting to where you're wanting to create a high performing team, that memorization of those things and understanding them is just the very first step. You have to take it past that and have it actually be meaningful to that team, so that when senior leadership actually does come around and ask that question, it is really telling the story and it is more personalized, and people really are not just bought into the idea, but they actually see that the things that they're doing are contributing to the bigger picture and they're invested in that. And I think that's what listening to this series of stories today has really brought back home for me, is in the position that I'm in coming into other organizations, how can I continue to make sure that that's front and center and we can flesh those things out and help connect the dots and not have it just be, the top down piece of that in terms of here's the expectations of what you need to do, but bringing people's stories together can really make that meaningful and can really make something that
beautiful alignment. Yeah.
Make it aligned and make it something to where it's not just I'm repeating back something that I've memorized or that we're trying to be consistent, but I'm really showing the passion and the energy and the commitment that comes to me knowing the role that I play and the things that I can bring to the table can be made to be a part of that. And even just thinking about team building sessions, doing things like 3 truths and a lie and just getting to know people, right? Sometimes you think the lie is this one thing, but that's really the truth. It's like, oh, that's cool. Let's learn more about your background or what you bring to the table that maybe, is that complementary skill that you're talking about, Roy, that maybe we don't know about that person unless we take the time to do those types of things and learn more about the people that we're working with. I think it's really fascinating, and it's fun to think about how you can do more of that in most organizations. Unless they're being intentional about doing those types of things, I don't think they'll ever really get that out of it.
One of the best examples I've ever seen is a local airline, and they started out their airline by allowing all of their employees to buy shares, and they increased their shares as part of their commitment as employees. And the way they presented that to the public was really fascinating. They have over years constantly shared the story about, I am an owner, from the front lines. And that huge, wonderful, this is our purpose in the world. And every single person in our organization has a story. So they would do video clips from the guys loading the luggage to the flight attendants, to the pilots, to everyone in the organization had a story to tell, how they were actually contributing to the purpose in the world. And it not only fostered this incredible family environment that they housed internally, but it fostered a corporate consumer commitment to want to use them. That storytelling, they're probably the best I've ever seen at it. And they did a fabulous job, grew that airline from a small little 4-town commuter to a global airline that flies all over. And so it's just a compelling way of saying we have a purpose. You didn't hear one of those people talk about the mission, vision, goals, Yeah.
I love
I would
that.
love, Patty, to actually hear the story of a suitcase. I was just visualizing you talking about like from check-in to baggage. How cool would it be? Would just to be like a documentary short
or a narrated
story.
A narrated story at every touch point. Yeah.
Exactly.
Here's what I think we do. I think we put me inside of a suitcase with a video camera and ship me to Hawaii, right? What do you think? I'll tell the story.
Hawaii's too good for you, Jim. It's too good. It's just too good for you.
Depends on who we ship you with.
I think
and
that
it depends on who has to drag the bag.
I think.
Ouch.
Wow. Let's get that quote out on the website. Greg Sanker, drag the bag. I was going to respond to Jeff by saying, sorry, Roy, I wanted to get this in. But one of the things when I conduct workshops, and it most frequently is around the topics of change management, where, somebody brings me in and says, can you help us with our change management? The presumption is we're struggling with that area, right? And so when I first started doing that, I came in and just said, hey, basically, here's a reason why you might want to improve your change management. Like, tell a good story, right? And what I found was that the response to that frequently was, so what you're saying is that we're doing everything wrong and you're the smart guy. I was like, no, that's not what I'm saying at all. And so what I started doing was listening to their story. Tell me your story. What is your experience with change management? What are your frustrations? What are your pain points? And they tell me that we're struggling with this, and I'm so tired of that, and these people never communicate, and all of a sudden now I'm being a group therapist, which I'm not qualified whatsoever, but letting them tell their story and letting them see themselves in the context. And then we say, so how can we fix some of those things? And I've even gotten to the point where I'll write those things down, like, hey, you find that really frustrating, so whatever we do, let's make sure we get back to that. And so allowing people to see themselves in the story, I think, is really important.
The most important question we can ask when we're looking for a solution is, how might we? And in order to get to the answer or answers that will bubble up into a thing, in order to get to the answers of that, you need insights. And the only way you can gain insights for how to answer the how might we question is by hearing the stories.
Yeah.
And if we don't listen to the stories at all levels, we can't get to a proper how might we. We begin operating top down again.
Yep.
Yeah. So as we thank Simone for chiming in from the road in the south of France, headed for Marseille.
By the way, that's Nîmes city in the distance.
Ah, Nîmes. That's
Yeah,
that's
Nîmes. We're nearly at
cool.
Nîmes. It is
Roman.
very Roman.
Very Roman.
For those of you that
It's
don't know
nice
your
to
history,
meme.
So you're Roman. You're
That's
roaming
me.
around France, is what we're saying. So,
oh dear,
so
All right.
me, Smalls.
I'm going to put myself in a suitcase and get shipped to France. That's what I'm going to do.
there we go.
When were we leaving France again?
Yeah.
As soon as he arrived.
Get out while you can.
Yeah.
So I'm going to wind up with another story, and I'm going to go back to something that Patty mentioned, and I wasn't expecting it. This is just you touched on something that has always drawn my interest, Patty. You talked about the petroglyphs.